This is part two of my series about Merkaba mysticism and apocalyptic gnosis and ascent into the heavenly places in early Christianity and Gnosticism. This is the new Patreon series number 9. Now, there are many sources of Christian Gnosticism, and scholars debate where they may have originated. But we do know that there were Babylonian and Palestinian Jewish midrashic interpretations of Genesis 1 through 6 in the centuries preceding the Christian era that definitely prepared the ground for Gnostic understanding. For example, Godhead emanating the worlds through intermediaries such as Memra, the Word, or Elohim, the angels, and the Chachma, divine wisdom. These ideas were not those that were carried forward in Christianity, which were based on the Platonistic idea of a demiurge and a creator God who was separate from the world he created, but rather a deity or a godhead, not actually a deity, that was identical with the world that he created, that basically he, she, it emanated itself into manifestation. And that's what we mean when we talk about an emanational kind of philosophy. And this is what we find in Gnosticism. Now in first century Alexandria, there was Hellenistic Jewish speculation on the figure of Sophia, the divine wisdom, or Chachma. Philo speculated that the words Adonai and Elohim were emanations of Yahweh. In the first and second centuries, Jewish Kabbalistic emanational thought was preserved in writings such as the Sefer Yetzirah, which represented a much older background in Jewish Midrash about Genesis 1 through 6 and the emanation of the worlds. In the first through third centuries, Jewish Christian gnosis was preserved in writings such as Eugnostus the Blessed and the Gospel of Mary and the Apocalypse of John, the Apocalypses, the first and second Apocalypses of James, and many other things. And there are ways that we can look at possible philosophical lineages from the Hellenistic Jewish gnosis. There is the lineage that was claimed by Valentinus, which he said was teaching that came from Paul through his student Theudas, who may have been the author of the later very esoteric Pauline Gospels like Ephesians and so on, to Valentinus. There is a lineage that is advocated by the heresy hunters of Simon Magus, and Simon is a Jewish name, Shimon, just like Peter's name. Peter was named Shimon, and he was given the name Kephas, which meant which was translated in Greek as Petros, and we call Peter, as an initiating name by Yeshua. But Shimon, who is probably not Simon Magus, but Shimon Megas, meaning Simon the Great, or Shimon the Great, is supposedly his teachings were taken and developed by Menander and then Saturninus. We'll look at that lineage later. There is the lineage claimed by Basilides, which claims to have come from the disciple Matthew, not necessarily the person who wrote the Gospel of Matthew, and was passed on to Basilides and Isidore. If you look at previous presentations that I've done, it's very interesting to look at the speculations of Basilides about the origins of the world and the emanation of the worlds. It follows very much the Jewish Kabbalistic midrash that was probably associated with Yeshua, or thought to be associated with Yeshua. And in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, we have Neo-Pythagorean and Middle Platonic philosophical traditions of emanation theology that were adopted by Christian philosophers and teachers. The Alexandrian Catechetical Christian Mystery School and its precursors were of this persuasion. These were Pantaenus, Basilides, Isidore, and so on. And the basic idea is that the cosmos emanates from the one who can never be known or understood, the unknown Father, as he's called, meaning a generator, and so on. So these are some of the schemes and ways of representing the schemes of these emanational theories. Now, in 2nd century Alexandria, there was an advanced catechetical school that was a place of teaching. Catechesis means to teach, and a catechism we think of today as just something that you memorize, but catechesis was a school of teaching philosophical thought, and that could go on for years and years. So there was an advanced catechetical school, the School of Alexandria, that eventually spawned both Gnostic philosophy and proto-orthodox, as it's been called, or normative Christian church theology in the later centuries. The school claimed its lineage through the writer of Mark's Gospel, who was a Roman Gentile Christian who was a disciple of Peter and supposedly an amanuensis, one who took down the teachings of Peter and the sayings of Peter and the remembrances of Peter when Peter came to Rome and taught in Rome. Now, the founders of the Alexandrian catechetical school may have had access to a Hellenized version of the inner circle Kabbalistic pre-Christian teachings of Yeshua, as we find, for example, in what we know of Basilides, or those from Paul through Theudas, as was claimed by Valentinus. Saint Pantaenus, by the way, is a legitimate Catholic saint today, even though he was considered to be heretical later, when the idea of heresy was defined in the church. So Gnostic Christianity was based on schools of Christian thought developed by teachers of advanced gnosis who competed for wealthy patrons and taught in the homes of their patrons. This is very different than a church tradition. In early Christian history, there were, of course, prophets that went from assembly to assembly and were hosted by them, as we find, for example, in the Didache. But also we have teachers who were teaching advanced gnosis, teachers that were Paul's opponents in Corinth, for example, who taught that there were different classes of people spiritually, and some would become enlightened and were destined to be, and so on. And we hear of this later in certain Gnostic schools that we'll be looking at. But here the teaching was based not on preaching, but upon the philosophical model of Greek philosophers who would teach in public places or teach at people's homes, and they would have patrons who would support them and pay for them. In some of the early Christian communities, the churches, these prophets, as they were called, would come by and stay for a few days, but they were not allowed to stay longer. But among the Greek philosophers, the patrons provided food and lodging and more clients, and so the people who were philosophers cultivated the relationship with wealthy patrons and taught in their homes to their people, and this became a model that was used for Gnostic teachers and Gnostic teaching as well as Christian teachers. And the distinction between Gnostic and Christian is one we make today, but did not really exist in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century. So As I say, this was the Greek philosophical academy model rather than the home church model of worshiping communities centered on catechesis and liturgical celebration. And therefore, Gnosticism, as we think of it today, survived through history rarely as a worshiping community. It was actually the school of a particular teacher. But it continued as a major influence in Eastern and Western Christian theology. Some exceptions were the Jewish Mandeans, who know very little about their own history, but have existed as a community since earliest times. And today there's a large settlement of them in Los Angeles who are doing their academic work to try to recover their own traditions and their own liturgies and so on. And scholars know very little about them, but what has been put together by older scholars like Dower and so on is available online. And then, of course, the Greek Valentinians, who became a very major opponent, or I should say competitor, to what we would call the normative or proto-Orthodox communities of Christianity. Valentinian theology survived through different kinds of vehicles and into modern period. Now, originally, the Greek word hieresis meant a sect or a school of philosophy. It was nothing negative. It simply meant a certain school of philosophy. But by the late 2nd century, Justin Martyr and IRENEAUS and Tertullian used the Greek term hieresis or heresy to mean wrong school of thought, founded by a sectarian teacher who was seducing the faithful with false Christian theology. By the 3rd century, Clement of Alexandria and Origen were teaching what they called the true gnosis of the Christian mystery school to advanced students of what would triumph eventually as normative or so-called proto-Orthodox Christianity. In the 4th century, partisans of Bishop Athanasius, who is a great Catholic saint, murdered and persecuted the pagan philosophers like Hypatia. They probably burned the Library of Alexandria, and they forced all the so-called heretics to find a refuge far away in the Upper Nile, at Akhmim and other places. These were Gnostics, Pythagoreans, alchemists, etc. And their writings were preserved there, and then with the invasion of Islamic forces in the 6th, 7th century, became the property of Islam, who had these Greek manuscripts, and then eventually they were sold back to European Christians in the early medieval period, 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, and translated into Latin and so on. And you can find them in English now, and they essentially kick-started the humanistic revolution of the medieval period. So let's take a look at the development of Christian Gnostic schools and sects as far as we can tell. Here's a basic outline of Jewish gnosis. The God of the Old Testament is not an evil lower deity, but the true Father of the universe, meaning the Father, Mother, the one who brings it forth out of himself. The Holy Spirit, or Chachma, or wisdom, Sophia, is not fallen, but the mother of creation and humanity. And a good reference I have for you is Reconstructing the Tradition of Sophia, Gnostic Tradition, by Deirdre Good, which you can find as a monograph in the Society of Biblical Literature online. And it is the angels under Satanael, or Satan, who fall, not humanity. and they work to enslave and delude humanity. So that's kind of the midrashic ideas that were very common between Jewish sages, among Jewish sages, and that Yeshua reflects in his teachings. Now, there are early Jewish Gnostics. We probably can speculate the Simonians from Shimon Megas, who was a Hellenistic Greek-speaking Jew. We find Peter as always the opponent of a so-called Simon Magus, meaning Simon the magician, which is a negative dig at him. In Luke Acts and later in the Clementine literature, we find probably the earliest forms of Jewish Gnosticism among the people that were eventually called the Sethians or the Barbelo-Gnostics. One of my old teachers that I studied with when I was doing my dissertation, John Turner, has an excellent article. You can find it, the link I have put here, about this early group. They were Greek-speaking Jewish Christian Gnostics of the 1st and 2nd century. They promoted the idea of the emanation of Godhead and into different entities that were lower. For example, they had the concept of a predestined race for gnosis and salvation, who were the seed of Seth. That's why they're called the Sethians. This literature, we don't have it in an exact, really pure form. It's been Christianized by Valentinians, and so it's very often considered to be Valentinian literature, but it does represent authentic Jewish gnosis concerning Chachma, or Sophia, and Jewish wisdom tradition and kind of oral midrashic Kabbalah that probably existed at that time. One of the most important and the earliest that represents this form of Jewish gnosis is what we have today called Gnostic the Blessed. Another is the Apocalypse of John, again considered to be Valentinian, and all the Magdalenic traditions, which show, by the way, Peter as the opponent of Mary Magdalene. And you find that in the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, and other legends. Mary Magdalene, by the earliest legends, went with the mother of Yeshua and the Apostle John to Asia Minor and founded communities, worshiping communities in Ephesus and other places. And undoubtedly, Mary Magdalene, who is very mature and is always represented in the Eastern iconography and so on as the strong one and the powerful one and the apostle to the apostles, and the mother of Jesus is represented really as just weak and as mourning for his death and so on. So we think Mary Magdalene is a very powerful force. Some scholars think that she's actually the beloved disciple referred to in the Gospel of John, which had to be masculinized in order to have credibility, because women by the end of the 1st century were considered not to be proper leaders of the church. In the sect of Dositheus, for example, a Jewish sect of Dositheus, it is said that he had 30 1/2 souls. That is, he had 30 disciples who had a full soul, and they were all male, and one disciple who was a female, so she had half a soul. And this is the kind of meaning we find in the Gospel of Thomas, the very last logion, as we have it preserved, where Peter says, well, she shouldn't be among us because she's a woman and she's not capable of all this sort of thing. And Yeshua says, but look, I will make her male like you males, and then she will be worthy, and so on. So these kinds of concepts existed at that time. Peter very much represents the proto-Orthodox or normative Christian theology that has no secrets, has no mysteries. It's all just basically about belief in the deity of Jesus and the worship of him and so on, versus Mary Magdalene, who represents very often the Gnostic and the mystery traditions. So the Valentinians were a very important force, because by the middle of the 2nd century, they became the most widely spread teachers of Christianity, who taught to the upper classes and to the wealthier classes, and had the most esoteric view of theology and Christology and so on. In their concept, there was a demiurge, there was a creator, but he wasn't a creator, he was emanated, and he was a lower god than the unknown deity, the unknown god, who was sometimes just called silence, Sige. And they used an emanation system that Valentinus said he learned in the Alexandrian school, possibly from Theudas, who had been a disciple of Paul. And they were teaching advanced Christianity through philosopher teachers. And the idea of Sophia as the Redeemer, not Jesus, but Sophia as the Redeemer of humanity. And then in the mid-2nd century, Marcion, the Ophites, and others brought in the concept of the God of the Old Testament as an evil demiurge, or at least he's a lower god that is concerned only with very strict justice and karma and so on. Yaldabaoth, or Samael, the blind god, the enemy of humanity. And so that's where you get this form of pessimistic Gnosticism. And the idea that Sophia, wisdom, Chachma, fell, that she sinned, and she fell, and she was the cause of the mistake that created the manifest universe. And the Gnostic goal at this time then was to escape the earth entirely, escape the evil earth. It was a little more than just overcoming, as it was, we find in the 4th Gospel, which is quite proto-Gnostic, where it speaks about overcoming the world of flesh and the devil. Here we're talking about escaping the world of flesh and the devil, as you find in other Gnostic traditions later. Now, IRENEAUS of Lyon was a bishop who had experienced persecution. The other bishops had actually been assassinated or killed in Lyon, in what today we call France, and he was facing a very extreme competition from Valentinians in the area, and although he didn't wish to do this, he was kind of forced, he felt, to put in a position to write long tomes exposing what was wrong about these teachers and what they were teaching. So he opposed the Gnostic churches, and we have his book, Against the Heresies. We have that writing and many other writings of IRENEAUS. And Tertullian, who was another one of the early church fathers, took up IRENEAUS's cause and expanded it further to come up with a history or a lineage of Gnostic heretics. And so he summarizes IRENEAUS's view that Gnosticism is a succession of thought from a lineage of specific heretical Gnostic teachers inspired by Satan. And here they are. Simon Magus, Simon the Magician, probably actually known as Shimon the Great to his followers, and supposedly he was succeeded in this fiendish lineage by Menander and then Saturninus. And then Basilides. Now Basilides does not claim this succession at all. He says that his teacher was, he had learned what he had learned from the disciple Matthew. But here Tertullian puts him into this, and IRENEAUS into this lineage. And then Carpocrates. And Carpocrates was pretty much despised by Clement of Alexandria and others. and he advocated homosexual initiation and things like this. Cerinthus, the Ebionites. Well, this is amazing because the Ebionites were probably the earliest organized Jewish Christian church from the 1st century, and they were probably what were known as the Minim, and who were anathema in the prayers of the Jewish synagogues in the 1st century. And the Ebionites were certainly not this far along in a lineage of Gnosticism, but this is the way where Tertullian puts them. And then the Nicolaitans, well, these are a sect that was supposedly formed by the deacon Nicolaus, who was supposedly a disciple of Jesus and became a hedonist. And then Cerdo, and then Marcion. And of course, Marcion does not claim a lineage from any of these people, but this is the way it appears in Tertullian. And then the Encratites and Tatian are claimed as part of this lineage. Actually, the writings of Tatian are extremely useful in determining the historical teachings of Yeshua, and they're very, very early. They're just end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century. So you can see by this time a church father like Tertullian has got things really quite confused. But this is the anti-Gnostic rhetoric and school that appears in the 3rd century, late 2nd, 3rd century. And then finally, they list the Barbelo-Gnostics, by which they mean the Valentinians, and that, of course, was very, very early. That was probably contemporary with the Ebionites in terms of history. So this lineage is completely fabricated. It's false. It's an attempt to show an evolution of thought among Gnostics, but it is really quite useless. And then finally they talk about the Sethian Ophites. Well, gee, these Sethians were probably similar to the opponents of Paul in Corinth in his authentic Corinthian epistles. So again, this is quite skewed. And then finally the Cainites, which are just another form of the Sethians. The Sethians and the Cainites, and actually in the Gospel of Judas and some other things like this, a very early interpretation, midrashic interpretation of Genesis and the scriptures associated with that in Jewish midrashic interpretation, saw things allegorically. And they considered the serpent who seduced Eve to actually be an emissary of the divine, of Godhead, and actually to be leading to the redemption, and so of humanity. And so, rather than seeing Cain as an enemy and Judas as an enemy, etc., these were all tools of the highest Godhead to create human beings who would self-generate themselves into a higher spiritual state. Now, fortunately, after World War II, we began to piece together and discover and put together the Nag Hammadi Coptic Gnostic Library from Kanabaskian. And for the first time, scholars were able to study Gnostic schools from their own point of view rather than from the point of view of their enemies. These documents were probably hidden to protect against the 4th century book burnings of the proto-Orthodox Christians. And they're written in Coptic. They're translated usually from Greek into Coptic, and some of them, such as the Gospel of Thomas, have very major Aramaic cores underlying them. And they are a source for scholars now to understand far better the diversity of early Christianity that the the distinction between Gnostic Christians and Proto-Orthodox Christians is somewhat artificial. We now understand that in early Christianity there were many different forms of understanding, and they were not one superior to the other, but when we had competition between different kinds of churches and schools of thought, between the Marcionites and the others who of Rome, who would have been more followers in the school of Justin Martyr, or IRENEAUS and LYON, and the Valentinians that he disliked in the same area, and the fact that there were churches of all kinds and types, just as we have denominations today, all kinds of denominations of different things, and they believe different things, and there's no one group that really can carry the banner of legitimacy over the others. In those days, Peter came to represent the apostolic succession, the succession of apostles from Peter and other disciples who became the bishops of the church. And that apostolic succession still goes today, and it represents very much what we call normative Christianity, the Proto-Orthodox Christianity. But there were those who felt that there were lineages and successions that were much more important than that. For example, the Paul to Theudas to Valentinus and so on, or the other lineages that we spoke about. And those were also considered to be legitimate. It was the triumph of the apostolic succession and the bishops that led to the primacy of Peter and primacy of Peter over Mary Magdalene and different things like that. So what we have here is a mishmash of competing ideas in different kinds of Christian expression in the early churches. There's no one monolithic church of any sort, and there's quite evidently many of the more esoteric teachings, the more Kabbalistic teachings of Yeshua, were understood better by some of the Gnostics than they were in the normative churches. Paul himself, who became really the basis for normative Christianity, was never a student of Yeshua, never met him. He studied with a Judean Pharisee, Gamaliel, and he learned the Judean Pharisaic traditions, and he argued about using them in that context when he argued for Christian, what he called faith, and so on. Yeshua was not a Judean Pharisee. He was a Galilean Pharisee, and the Galilean sages were quite much in opposition to the ideas of the Judean sages. You find preserved in all the four Gospels, well, the three Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, Yeshua's challenge to the Judean Pharisees, who believed that Messiah would be the son of David, a Davidic Messiah, a warrior Messiah who would come out of the sky and so on. And he said, why do you say that Messiah is the son of David, when in fact David said, the Lord said to my Lord, if he is his Lord, then how can he be his son, and so on. He argues against the idea of a Davidic Messiah, and yet in the New Testament and in the Pauline traditions, Yeshua is typified as a Davidic Messiah, a son of David, a descendant of David, and will come again in glory as a warrior out of the skies and all this sort of thing. So we don't have a good way to get back to the teachings of Yeshua through Paul, except indirectly. However, some of these teachings may be better preserved in things like the Aramaic core of the Gospel of Thomas, in some of the sayings preserved by Tatian and many others. So it's much more of a wealth of information that we have today because of the discovery of the Coptic Gnostic Library and what it contains. So if we take a look at that library, I put in red the possible Merkaba traditions, in green the early Gnostic and Jewish Christian type traditions, in blue the Sethian and Valentinian, in violet the Valentinian, purely Valentinian, and in black all kinds of others that may be Valentinian or Gnostic or Hermetic or Platonic. And just so you'll see what kind of a mix there is, and this is still stuff that's being sorted out by scholars. But in the first codex, the LYON codex, we have these particular things, some of which are Valentinian, others of which may not be. In the second codex, we have, as you can see, a variety of different kinds of thought about Christianity. And in the third codex, we have another version of the Apocryphon of John, and so on. The Sophia of Jesus Christ, the Pistis Sophia, Eugnostus the Blessed. In Codex 4, we have another version of the Apocryphon, the Gospel of the Egyptians, which is very important. Codex 5, we have another version of Eugnostus the Blessed, and some that represent traditions that may be related to Merkaba traditions. In Codex 6, we have many that may be Valentinian and other kinds of things. One that I've put in purple here, the Discourse on the 8th and the 9th, is the one that I translated and interpreted for my doctoral dissertation. It's a Hermetic initiation document that dates from the early 1st century. In terms of the astrological dating that is written into the text itself. And this codex also contains several other Valentinian and possibly Merkaba, early Jewish kinds of traditions. The next codices contain a variety of other things. And this is the complete library that we have. It's in Coptic. It was translated from earlier forms of Greek. And as I say, some of these, like the Gospel of Thomas, even have really important Aramaic language cores that we can use to get back to the historical teachings of Yeshua. Now, the next slides I'm going to show you are slides about the heavenly eternities and the Enochian Shemayim that form the basic map of consciousness for Hermetic, Gnostic, and Jewish ecstatic ascent and revelation and Merkaba mysticism. And they're taken from my seminar on the Gospel of Mary and my seminar on Gnosticism, Ancient and Modern, and these are available on the catalog page of my teaching website, wisdomseminars.org. So I'm going to let you watch these slides to get a better idea of what this map of consciousness was that was being used. Now, let's just take a look at what the idea of these heavens would be. There is a lower area. As a matter of fact, it's called the lower foundation, Arcos. I'm showing you a sort of a drawing I made once of what the shape of the universe was, the macrocosm, according to the stories that we find in the Secrets of Enoch and Second Enoch and some of the Enochian literature. And at the very basis, under the earth, in the underworld, we have Arcos, who's kind of almost like an anti-god to Adoil, who's the god of light. But this is not our God. These are two parts of the creation that oppose each other. And just as light opposes darkness, so the dark forces oppose the light forces, and so on. And man is created by wisdom. Guess what wisdom is? Chachma. Later on, Sophia. And this is the story we find in the early Jewish wisdom literature. It's man is created by wisdom. Now, the first seven heavens, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh heavens, each have specific characteristics according to the Enochian scheme of the heavens. And you'll find this in all the literature of Enoch. The first heaven is where the treasuries of the snow and the clouds are, and there are certain kinds of angels that oversee these things, and and it's like a vast sea. It's like the sky that we look at. The second one is a place where apostate angels await judgment, and crucified men and hanged men appear. Images that are very awful and terrifying are seen in the second heaven. And there are deceased men who act and look like angels. But the third heaven is a very interesting heaven. On one side, we have Hades to the north. And to the other side, to the south, we have Eden. We have paradise. And that is where Paul ascended. And then we have a higher heaven, which is the abode of the sun and the moon, and then beyond that, the Grigori, the Nephilim, and Prince Satanel. That's the heaven to which the leaders of the rebellion have been reposited, the rebellion in heaven, and above that, the archangels, and so on. Now, the throne of God is above all of that in the 10th heaven. And the goal of the visionary ascent in Jewish Merkava mysticism was to ascend to the throne of God. But to ascend to these other different states of reality and consciousness was also something that was done in Judaism. Now, this is the place that Paul says he found himself in. He ascended into the south part of heaven, Eden, paradise. This place, the 8th heaven, is the location of the zodiac, the zodiacal stars, the fixed stars that do not move. The wandering stars are different, but by the time that this was developed in the Enochian system, this was not made coherent with the astrological and astronomical understanding of the universe that would come later and would develop in the next few centuries. And in this astronomical development, there would be 7 planets that would rule each of these 7 heavens, the first through the 7th heaven. And these are the powers and the principalities, the archons and the exousias and so on. And above that would be the zodiac. Now, the zodiac is the place where the ascended saints like Moses and Elijah and so on would be hanging out there. This was called the 8th heaven, the Agdoad. Now let's take a look at the astrological implications, the way the human soul is related to the great cosmic soul, the microcosm and the macrocosm. These are the Gnostic spheres and the Sethian-Ophite initiatic circles, which were used for initiation. They're still used in Martinism and among the Elocoans for their forms of Gnostic initiation. They developed from the Mithraic planetary sphere form of initiation, and this is the idea. The individual human soul is a microcosm of the great universe, the macrocosm. And within the human soul are all the harmonies that are derived from the macrocosm at the moment of birth, the moment of the first breath being taken. And that is inscribed and embedded upon the human soul, and the human soul then needs to interact with this horoscope that belongs to that soul. It needs to interact with all the external forces in the universe throughout its life. It gives them strengths, it gives them weaknesses, it gives them challenges, etc. Now let's take a look at some of the areas. Let's look at the geography of the human soul and of the macrocosm. We have here the various spheres, beginning with the sphere of the moon, which is a fast-moving planet. All these are the spheres of the planets arranged according to their apparent motion around the Earth. Below the Earth is Tartaros, which is the classic and typical Greek mythological place where all the original beings from the earlier cosmos were imprisoned, and they cause earthquakes and volcanoes and things. And so this whole level, a level of 7 levels of initiation, is what brings us up to the top level. Now, in the Jewish Merkaba mysticism, paradise is not found at the top level beyond the 8th sphere. The paradise is not found in the Agdoad. Paradise is actually found in the 2nd heaven. And other heavens relate to different things. It's an entirely different system than the astrological system we see here. But here, what is important is the 8th heaven, the Agdoad, the Agdoas. That is where the ascended masters live. They live in the realm of the zodiac. And that is where you find the constellations of Heracles and all the great ascended masters. Beyond that, there is a 9th and an Ennead. And that 9th is something that doesn't contain individuality. It just contains the monadic rays that come from the original light of the highest form of deity. You can kind of see it diagrammed here below where it says life and providence and Sophia and so on. And at the very top, and this is of course a Christian version of this, but at the very top you find the throne of God. And here it says Father and Son and Agape and so on. But basically at that level is the level from which all things emanate. One can never actually get to that level. But this is what these kind of 4 heavens are. We find these 4 levels in the Kabbalistic understanding of the worlds, of the lowest world of Asiya, and all the way on up to the highest world. Now, we're going to look at the theory of the descent of the macrocosmic soul, which comes from the fixed realm of the zodiac originally, for incarnation in birth. So here is basically what you will find in the Timaeus of Plato and the Kore Cosmou of Trismegistus and so on. And this is a basic kind of idea that people have of where the soul originates and how it goes through different processes. First of all, there are spheres or rulerships, and each of these is established at a distance from the Earth. At the outermost distance we have Kronos, or what we would think of as Saturn. He's a deity, he's a power, he's authority. He's an authority that is set there to rule. It's a limit. It's a gateway. He's a gatekeeper. And so we refer to these as the powers and principalities that Paul talks about. These are the authorities. And they govern many, many things about human beings. What kinds of personality they're going to have, what kinds of fate they're going to have, and so on. And then at the that was at the 7th sphere. At the 6th sphere we have another god. The god Jupiter is associated with this, or Zeus, in some schemes of thought. And then we have the 5th
Mars. The fourth, we have the Sun. The third, we have Venus. The second, Mercury. And at the very lowest and closest to the Earth, the Moon. And the Moon is beneath the lunar sphere. Now these are beings. These are gods. These are called daimoni, demons. Now you must understand that to the Greeks the word demon didn't mean a devil, but it meant a little god. It meant a lower god, an inferior god, the one that rules under the higher gods. So it's a lower, but above us it's a much higher authority, but below the highest gods it's a lower authority, so to speak, in the astral world. And these powers and principalities rule many things about us. For example, when we are first born into the earth, we descend through these 7 spheres. And whatever position or whatever configuration these ruling lights are in at the moment we're born, and it changes and goes through hundreds of millions of possible combinations at all times, we pick that up. Our soul picks that up because our soul is a microcosm of that macrocosm. And so the harmony of our own spheres inside of our own soul picks up by sympathy exactly the same vibration and the same configuration, and that moment in time in which we are born gives us our ethos, our astral or sidereal ethos, which is known to the Hebrews as the nephesh, and to us as your personality. And that is what the horoscope is about. The horoscope is a map of that moment in time when you took your first breath. That's the time that you came down from the heavens, you took your first breath. And so this is what the descent of the microcosmic soul through the macrocosm and incarnation and birth is, and it determines many things about whether you be short or tall, musically talented, fat or thin, what kinds of fate you will have. Now after death, the soul yearns to return to its abode, its place of origin, the divine energies in the zodiac, in the sky, the energies of the psyche, the soul. But the psychic energies are trapped in the earth. They're trapped by the kinds of things that they have generated in their own lives, because their life on earth has been, for the philosopher, the point of the life on earth has been to purify the soul by following the direction of the right, the philosopher's way, by following the motions of the good Keizer, by doing the right things and being sensitive to the promptings of the higher worlds, the soul grows and the soul loses its bondage to the things that are in the earth and the energies that come out of the sky. So the soul's going to have to leave this planet, and he's going to have to ascend through the lunar sphere from the sublunary world, and through the sphere of, we will call the sphere of Hermes, and the sphere of Venus. Now let's represent the sphere of Venus by the daimon, by the demon, the avenger, the torturer, the gatekeeper that stays there. Now remember, you have picked up all that you are and all you know of yourself, your personality, your nephesh, your sidereal body, from the configuration that was implanted through sympathy onto the harmonia of the spheres in your own microcosmic soul. So everything that you picked up has 2 aspects. It's like a double-edged sword. It has the good and the bad. And what you have to do is overcome the disharmonies in order to get it through the harmonies of the spheres. Well, let's look at this third harmony. This is the sphere of Venus. Sphere of, in the positive sense, artistic things and love and sweetness and music and so on. But on the negative side, selfish desire, gluttony, overdoing of things, overweening desire, etc. Let's say that you as a person may not have overcome all these elements that you have in yourself. Now, you have to not only overcome that, but you have to overcome the negative parts of all the other things that you have inherited from the rulers, the rulers of Hammadi. So when the time comes for your death, you try to ascend. Your soul tries to leave the body behind. The body decays and your soul is free, and it goes through the first sphere, the second sphere, but it gets to the third sphere. It cannot go any farther, because at that point you are pulled back by the negative lusts and desires and unfulfilled things of your life, and you return to life again sometime later through the process known as reincarnation. However, let's say that instead you have been a person who has purified yourself. You've purified your animal instincts and desires. You've purified all the things in you that would lead to injustice and anger and disharmonies, and you've made yourself, attuned yourself to heaven. So when you die, you're going to ascend through all the spheres. You will hit each one of these gatekeepers, and you will be able to go right through. And you will ascend to the 8th sphere, the Ogdoad, the 8th heaven, where the saints and the holy ones have gathered, and they work from there to teach and help human beings telepathically.
Now, the form of Merkaba Shakad, or meditation, or possibly initiation, that was used by Yeshua, that we see in the Transfiguration, and we also find in some other areas, like the Gospel of Mary, was not a full ascent to the 10th heaven, to the throne of God, as it had been with the prophets and with Yeshua, but rather it was an ascent of purification, or an ascent of illumination. And this may have been what Yeshua was using for the disciples to whom he gave initiatic names. It may have been an initiatory form of Merkaba experience transmitted by Yeshua, related to the Transfiguration, Shakad, of Peter, James, and John. And we want to take a look at what that might have been. It's different from the ascent to the Merkaba, or chariot throne of God, in the 10th heaven. It's similar to first century Hermetic initiation, which involved the ascent to the 8th heaven, or the Ogdoad, for initiation of a new Hermes, a completely initiated Hermetic. It was an initiation into the Machom, or place of the Kima, or the ascended saints. The abode of the saints, the Jewish saints, was in the eternal life of the Olam, which is translated in the New Testament as eternal life, but that's not what it really says or means. And so, yes, thus Yeshua gives Peter, James, and John a glimpse of these ascended saints, Moses and Elijah, and so on. In the traditions that we have of first century Hermetic initiation, the ascended saints, the Hermetic saints, telepathically advise and assist humans on earth who are capable of making the connection with them. The same seems to be implied in the Transfiguration. Perhaps the Transfiguration and encounter with eternally living Jewish saints was a lesser mystery of Merkaba mysticism. But if it were an initiatic ascent for advanced disciples, such as implied by the Johannine term, the birth from above, or rather translated or paraphrased as spiritual rebirth, then it probably parallels the macrocosmic journeys of purification we find in Hellenistic and other traditions. For example, the mysteries of Hermes Trismegistus, the ascent into the heavens under the Ogdoas, as we've mentioned before. The mysteries of the full Archoi that were transmitted by Pythagoras and Empedocles and others was a guided descent into the divine underworld. Now, the divine underworld was just another way of describing the interior mystic worlds. The heavens, the Shemayims, were seen as ascending. The divine underworld was seen as a descent. It's all to the same place. It's all to the same experience in human meditation. The purpose was the purification of what would be known in Judaism as the nephesh, or the lower soul. So that thus it was done while one was in flesh. One went through the same experience, in a sense, as dying, but remained alive in his body and returned to his body. And it was a way of obtaining the messianic mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, as it's called in the New Testament, which is really the ratzim of the malkuth of the heavens. So we're going to take a look at this description we find in the Gospel of Mary, which is not yet Valentinian. It's not yet turned into anything that sounds like the teachings of Marcion, or the negative thing about a lower God and so on. It's just an ascent through the heavens, but using a starting place of the four elements that certainly shows a relationship to some of the earlier Hellenistic forms of mystic ascent or descent.
As we look at the story told in the Gospel of Mary, we seem to have four olamim, four worlds. And these might correlate, as they do in the Empedoclean and Pythagorean concepts of reality, to the four elements. And so initiation by Yeshua may have taken some kind of form like this. We have four elemental realms: earth, water, air, and fire. Now, fire is the realm of the heavens. Earth, water, and air are the realms that contribute to the body. They might be somewhat analogous to Tartarus and so on of the Greeks. But there is the realm of water, the realm of earth, and the realm of air. These three worlds, in terms of their negative aspects, the parts that one has to be purified from in order to be released from, they then take back in death all that they have given you, and then you enter the fiery world, the world of fire. And that world is a world of the 7 divisions. And they probably are 7 divisions much like the others, but it is from that world of fire, or in that world of fire, that one makes an ascent, a fiery ascent. And so one goes through angelic beings, or whatever they are, that guard these realms. I'm using some different kinds of representations this time. And one ascends through each of them, and one has to be approved by each of them. These are the powers and the principalities and the authorities, etc. Now, if Miriam is being, well, the way it was put in the very negative sense was she was exorcised of 7 demons. That's the way it's represented to marginalize her in the later period that I referred to, the period of marginalization. Then she is going through these 7 powers, and she is being purified in some way from these 7 powers. Now, there's no way to really know whether these last 7 are something that the Gnostics have put in here as a 7-fold division of the 4th world, the 4th olam, that we're really talking about the 4 Kabbalistic worlds through which she passes and is purified, or whether this was really part of the initiation, the purification that she went through in learning the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, or experiencing them. But since in Luke's gospel it's made clear that Mary Magdalene is the one from whom Yeshua had exorcised 7 demons, I think that the sevenfold thing is probably very original. Now, it could also be a fiction. It could be something based on that 7 demons thing, possibly 2. But I think it's more likely that it's part of the original gnosis that was present. Now, according to this situation then, Yeshua would raise her through these realms, whether we call them earth, water, air, and fire or not. They're 4 olamim, they're 4 worlds, they're 4 universes, 4 states of being. And that she would be purified, so that she would no longer, the forces and energies in these things would no longer have power over her. She would be a person who was in the world but not of the world. And although it's not clear whether she made an ascent, complete ascent to the Ogdoad or to the throne of God, we don't know exactly what it was because we're not taken to that point. It's clear that she was brought up through all that she would have to be taken through after death to achieve purification. She was brought back through this process, back to earth as one who had the status of an ascended saint. She was already pure, and she's walking on the earth in flesh. So she was bringing that heavenly estate back to earth. She was incarnating this new humanity, this new soul, this son or scion of humanity, son of man, scion of humanity. And so she was brought back into the earth perfected. The Greek word is teleos, or you might say shalem in the Hebrew or Aramaic. She's brought back as a perfected being. And her soul has been perfected. She has perfected her discipleship and her soul, and she no longer has within herself any kind of subjectivity and any kind of vulnerability to the negative and evil forces that usually run all of humanity and society. And that would be then this final initiation that Yeshua would have performed, so that at her death she would ascend immediately into the heavens. So Mary Magdalene is therefore one that we would consider to be the most initiated, or one of the most initiated, because we don't know of other beings who they might have been, whether the person in the Gospel of Mark is an ideal person or a real historical person, whether this is the Lazarus of John's Gospel, who is the brother, according to them, of Mary and Martha, or what. But we do know that Mary Magdalene is associated with some kind of very strong initiatic tradition. She was highly respected. She was old enough to be the mother of Yeshua. She died of old age just a few years after having been in Rome, according to tradition. So by AD 70s, she would have been an old woman and have passed away, and or even actually by earlier than that. And that John the Apostle lived probably at least another generation and a half or 2 longer than she did. So she was an elderly woman at that time, and she had been probably the age of Yeshua's mother at the time of his teaching.
Well, thank you for watching this presentation. Please click on the Patreon link in my description just below the YouTube video to become a patron, helping to sponsor my new videos on the pre-Christian teachings of Yeshua. Thank you very much.